All right, well, welcome, welcome. We have a really interesting discussion for you today. I'm so pleased that Javi Melendez has been able to join us today, and we are discussing the impact of colonization on organizations, and that may seem like two concepts that really don't go together. But by the end of this, we will hopefully have made those connections because we're taking some lessons from decolonizing therapy. And I'm really pleased to welcome Iain today. And Harvey, I might start by getting you to introduce yourself, and then perhaps, Iain, you could talk about how you two connected because that's a really interesting story.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So my name is Javier Melendez. I go by Javi for short. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in Texas and California in the US. And I also am a mental health therapist and the creator of eutierria therapy, which is my private practice. I guess I could say a little bit more about what eutierria therapy is. Eutierria therapy is it's my attempt, my approach to creating a decolonized approach to therapy, where I help people to connect to their earth-based identities by tapping into their ancestry and tapping into Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous knowledge. And through that, healing trauma, individual trauma, but then also our collective trauma as a people as well.
And Harvey, where are you today? Let's situate ourselves in the land that we're on. I'm coming to you from the Wurundjeri, from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And Iain, I think you're in the
I'm
same.
on the unceded lands of the Djajawarung people who are part of the Wurundjeri Nation.
And Harvey, where are you today?
And I'm on the Coahuiltecan territory, which contains a lot of different people groups, but Coahuiltecan is what we refer to them as.
Wonderful.
Wow.
And so now you two have a really interesting story about how you connected. So Iain, how did you connect with Harvey?
Well, when I went cold turkey on Twitter, I moved across to Threads and discovered Javier posting about eutierria therapy and decolonisation, which both resonate with me very strongly with my background in environmental psychology, the book that I'm putting together at the moment with First Nations writers about, I guess, trying to decolonize Western society's relationship to place and reconnecting people to nature. I've done work in the past around the health benefits of contact with nature. So I started reading Javi's posts and it all came together. And I reached out to Javier, I think via your website, Javier. I stalked you and found you and wrote to you. And we started a conversation through email about the way that our respective interests overlap. Yeah, and I having lived in the US and having just come back from the Americas, South, Central, and North, I was really inspired by the work that Javier is leading. I think it's cutting edge.
Fantastic. And so let's go to that a little bit. So Javier, what is your journey of decolonization yourself? Because I think we're talking about that term, but people might not really be aware of what that concept is. I think in when you live in countries like Australia, you've got a sense of it, but let's not assume that we understand what that is. So, perhaps if you could tell us your story and how you came to this and what your understandings are, and then we can get closer to that.
Absolutely. So I think it's really important to recognize that when we say decolonization, it's not meant to be a metaphor. It's very literal. What it means, it's a dismantling of colonial and oppressive frameworks that have shaped our reality as we know it today. And recognizing that we have dismissed and marginalized a lot of Indigenous and non-Western ways of thinking and understanding of how to create the world, and allowing ourselves to bring that back, and to give opportunity, to give voice to those voices that didn't get an opportunity to create the world that we currently live in right now.
And how did you come to this? What's your journey? So you're a therapist, you're a clinical therapist. How did you come to this kind of way of looking at the world? Because obviously this is the way you look at your practice as well. And
Yes.
so tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's both. I come at it from both a professional perspective, but also a personal perspective. Professionally speaking, much of modern day psychology is Western psychology, and it's very Eurocentric. So it's not really taking into account the way that Indigenous or non-Western people groups would have understood the mind or the psyche. And so as a result, all of our mental health care practices are also from this Western psychology framework, which comes from this colonial framework as well. So everything that I've been learning in my training has been from that framework, and I'm realizing that it doesn't really give space, and it's not always as applicable or relevant to people that are coming from more Indigenous and non-Western frameworks. So that's one aspect of it, of how I got into this and wanting to shift how I do my practice. But the other aspect is more personal. My family is from Ceiba, Puerto Rico, which is the oldest colony in the world. It is a colony of the U.S. Although many people may not necessarily recognize it as such, it is still a colony of the U.S.
Mm.
And as a result, we have lost a lot of our Indigenous ways. And I've been on a journey of reconnecting with my own heritage, my Puerto Rican heritage, but then also my Indigenous heritage. I'm a member of the Hiwayawa Taino of the Caribbean. That's what's really been helping me do this reconnection journey and to find what does it mean to re-indigenize myself and to decolonize myself as well.
It's really interesting. And Iain, how does that relate to the work that you do around, or the way that you think about health and place? And what are you thinking about when you think about these concepts? What does it mean for you?
I should have added, when I was commenting about how I met Javier, when I went to his website, I was astonished to find Javier's blog went into great detail celebrating the work of Dr. Tyson Yokopun, who's a First Nations author from Australia, who is based at Deakin University, where Josie and I used to work in the public health field. So our worlds definitely overlapped, which I guess is a segue into answering your question. The book that I'm working on, I've had the privilege of sitting down with some amazing First Nations contributors who are yarning about country, and this notion of country is so five-dimensional, it's probably 6 or 7-dimensional, it sort of wipes the floor with very Western concepts. Because in the world of environmental psychology, we have this notion of sense of place, which is a kind of a cliche in Western world, although the ancient Romans talked about spiritus loci, which is the spirit of place. I think all people have got the capacity to think about country or dream about country, which is every single thing around you, you belong to it and you have a responsibility to care for it. It provides you information about how to move through this world and this life. It gives you guidance about the world that your ancestors. And so I guess Javier's work also resonates with me as a settler colonial migrant to Australia. And I think part of my motivation for doing the book, I think I've mentioned to both of you, each of you individually, 4 years ago during the worst of the COVID lockdowns, I sat down at this very table and I said, I've got to do something because I'm going insane. I think I started writing about my own journey as a settler colonial in Australia and trying to unpack place. So Javier's work integrates completely into that space, and I'm hoping that I can draw on some of the knowledge and wisdom that Javier holds in this work. I've been carrying around Sand Talk by Tyson Yokopun for about 4 years. It's like a talisman. I carry it everywhere as a sacred object, but it's almost too overwhelming to read. It's like I don't know. It's like this. It's just like standing in front of an explosion. There's so much information in it that I struggle to wrap my white colonial brain around it.
This is a book about Sand Talk.
It's a book about knowledge. It's a book about two ways of learning. Actually, Harvey, why don't you talk about this? Because you've read every page. I've managed to get halfway through it.
It's definitely one of my favorite books. It's definitely I would consider it a sacred object for myself as well. I refer to it very frequently. So the title of the book is Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. I love that title. I think it's very fitting. I think that Tyson Yokopun did a really good job at presenting an idea that could potentially save the world. He teaches how to think indigenously. He shares these five minds, which are 5 very common ways that many different Indigenous groups practice, and how if we start thinking through these 5 minds, we can change the world. We can save the world. The way he writes it is coming from like a sustainability lens, like an eco lens, and he coins this term sustainability agents, and I really like that idea. And yeah, so I think a lot of my work is trying to help individuals learn how to think more indigenously, because we are all indigenous on this earth. And so how do we come back to the roots, come back to the land, and learn how to live with it and in harmony with all the rest of life on the planet.
And Javier, for what end? So now I want to bring it back, because I'm thinking, how do I apply this in my daily life? I work with organizations. Often we do care about well-being in organizations. We care about particularly preventing harm in terms of psychological well-being as well as physical well-being. What's the so what? Because I think people listening to this might be thinking, wow, these concepts are really in the clouds for me, particularly if you don't come from an academic background. I think that we need to bring it down. So, and I love to hear about that. What does it mean for you? Maybe what does it mean for you? What does it mean for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you kind of bringing it down to the more practical level. I think something that's really important about this process of decolonization is that what we're doing is we're allowing ourselves to give more voice and inclusivity to the knowledges and to the people groups that have carried the knowledges that have sustained us as a people on this planet for I don't know how long, like a very long time. And learning how to go back to that wisdom, going back to that knowledge. And if we're talking like in organizations, and especially if we live more in urban settings, like I think learning how to commune with the earth and develop our society in a way that is in harmony with earth, it's going to be good for all of us, and so we will probably get more specific than that, but I think that's the so what for me. Yeah.
And what I'm thinking about are the ways in which we perhaps make choices in our day about the voices that we allow in. So, for example, if we're making a decision about something in the workplace or at home, what wisdom are we listening to? Where does that wisdom come from? And are we missing? Because I think what we're talking about here is we are missing the opportunity to use the wisdom, to your point, Javier, the people that have sustained us for so long, our ancestors, our Indigenous brothers and sisters and uncles and aunties. They've been here for longer than we have when we go back, but that wisdom perhaps hasn't been translated in a modern world, in a world where perhaps a rational mind takes over and supersedes other types of minds. So I haven't read Sand Talk, and I'll put that in the show notes. That's going to be on my book list. So I think for me, it's about perhaps making different choices about where we search for knowledge, and also the type of knowledge that we see as valid. And particularly today, I think about where information comes from and the rhetoric around fake news and the reality of fake news, because I think there's a rhetoric and a reality around that. That's a real problem for me. What do we listen to? Iain, do you want to comment on that?
I was explaining my fascination and reverence for the notion of country, and having worked in human services and welfare and psychology for a long time, I had a revelation whilst preparing the book, going into some of the Australian policy documents around health plans, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander public health plan. It's like a 10-year plan. There's a whole section on there on country, and one of the things that it says is that from an Indigenous Australian perspective, if you are on country, you are home. It doesn't matter if you don't have a house. It doesn't matter if your house isn't great. You are home. And forced removal from country is the most devastating form of homelessness I think humans can imagine, because you're actually being ripped from not just your mother, but your Mother Earth as well. And so in terms of policy, First Nations peoples who have survived colonisation are being dealt with by settler colonial institutions who are carrying around settler colonial understandings of place and home. And in fact, First Nations people, my understanding is that a lot of First Nations peoples in Australia look to settler colonial people with a almost, I don't want to use the word pity, but there's a kind of sadness because that two-way knowledge doesn't exist. And I sometimes wonder whether I'm living in a sort of black and white world before Dorothy ends up in Oz, going to colour. And I think the opportunity for two-way exchange and for institutions and organisations to embrace and adapt to that is really important. Can I tell you a quick story about something that happened to me just 2 days ago? I work part-time for a cancer organisation, and 2 days ago I met with a service who were interested to draw on my support to create a grant opportunity to submit funding for support to deliver an improvement to their cancer service that would bring in First Nations health specialists and people from the local Indigenous community. And we had this meeting, and it was between myself and a colleague online and 3 members of this organisation, the health service. And we didn't do what you did before when we first met. None of us said who we were, where we were from. I did say what country I was on, but there was no opportunity for those 3 people in that service to identify whether they might have been First Nations themselves. And afterwards, I thought, oh my God, what a lost opportunity. And Western organisations, the way we introduce ourselves, we rush straight into what job title we have. But the notion of talking about where we're from and where we stand on the earth, and I mean, that stuff, for me, that's decolonisation 101, is to bring place and heritage into the talk, because you automatically create trust and, people know where each other are from. And I think there are some very practical small steps that people can take to actually anchor organisational discourse, even the work that goes on inside an organisation, to bring that material in. Because most of us know we've worked alongside people for dozens of years and don't know who they are, really.
I think that element of connection is so important. I work a lot, even when I work with teams and when I work in organisations creating more inclusive culture or creating stronger culture, that is so important to really get to know one another, and not just get to know one another because of what we can do, what we do, who we are. And I think that who we are goes into that space, which is sharing more at a vulnerable and deeper space. So absolutely, totally agree with you, Iain. So that's maybe one thing, isn't it? A way of kind of shifting our understanding of who's around us and what they bring. I'm always have this realization when I travel away from Australia, I bring the land with me. And I had this realization the first time I was in the States, and I went to New York and I saw the beaches in New York right in front of all these tenement buildings, really. And the beaches were almost strangled in this urban environment. And I walked on that beach, but what I had behind me was the Australian shore. It was such an interesting experience for me. I'd never experienced that before. It was almost like I was bringing my sense of place with me to help me manage the anxiety of seeing this strangled environment. So that for me, that's a deep experience that helps me manage my current environment. And you can imagine that we could do that much more effectively when we're, in workplaces, in organizations. If we knew about each other a little bit more, we could harness some of that wisdom for each other. Javier, I'm keen to know, how does this concept change the way you do therapy with people? Your practice.
I'm actually thinking about something that Iain said. If I could just speak to that
You can absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate this idea that we're talking about, of how we introduce ourselves and how we connect. Even how I introduced myself at the beginning here wasn't necessarily the way that I would have loved to introduce myself. But I think we're onto something, by understanding where we've been, literally the geographic location of the place. This tells a lot about who we become, and as we move to different places and we live in different areas, that shapes us, that transforms who we are as people. For example, I didn't get to grow up on the island. Family. I grew up at the border of Texas and Mexico, And that significantly shaped aspects of who I was, who I am, and who I've become. And then moved across the US and lived in different areas in the US. And all of those different lands have shaped who I am today. So if in organizations we could bring in more opportunities to really get to know each other and to learn each other's stories, more relation based, and I think that is a way to decolonize, to be more relation based, and to not it's not just focusing on the work in of itself. It's about understanding the people that you are in relationship with as you're creating and crafting something. So I think that's a lovely notion. But to answer the question that you're asking, like how I bring this into my work, I do a lot of identity work with my clients and really trying to understand like who am I? Who are we? Where do we come from? What is our story? And what is the story of our ancestors and our immediate family, our grandparents, the ones before us? And how does all of that then impact who we are today? I do a lot of work with focusing on intergenerational trauma and healing our intergenerational trauma. All of that plays a role into our sense of identity as well. So lots of overlap for sure.
I'm just thinking there's a really lovely team-based method that I use, which is called Story of Self. It actually comes from the public narrative work from Marshall Jans from Harvard University, and his and it was used actually in the campaigns when Obama was running for president, to connect with people that perhaps hadn't been connected before around political race and particularly voting in America. I think he connected with the younger population. And Story of Self is about really creating a sense of who we are by looking at the choice points in our lives. And because when we make a choice, it tells a lot about our values. And so I could tell you a story about, for example, a childhood experience I had where I had to make a choice between whether I was going to join the bully pack or whether I was going to advocate for the person who was being bullied. And I chose to befriend the girl who was being bullied. And when I tell that story, hopefully, when I tell it well, it expresses the values I have around inclusiveness, fairness, and equity and equality. You've made me think, when thinking about this conversation, you've made me think about what would the story of self be if I was talking about some of the history that goes back further, that goes back to my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation, and the choices that were made there. And so that could be an interesting way of defining and redefining me in terms of who I am, but also how I express who I am. Because I think that there's a lot of choice points, because I think sometimes choice points aren't necessarily choices we have, it's choices we make based on the situation that we're in and the values that are being expressed at the time. So yeah, that could be quite interesting. And I think that would definitely, for me, bring up some intergenerational trauma. So that would be an interesting thing to do. I'm going to work on that one. Thank you. What about you, Iain? What are you thinking about at the moment?
Oh, I'm thinking about the myriad moments that I had working in government, especially in the health and welfare sector, where our organisations were full of what we call dot paintings, which is meant to be a term of respect, but it can be used disparagingly as well. First Nations art that sort of decorated the walls. And I worked closely at the time with a Yorta Yorta woman who'd been brought in to head up the Aboriginal team, but she quickly realised that the paintings were, I wouldn't say smokescreen, but they were an inauthentic or possibly half-baked response to trying to acknowledge country and acknowledge intergenerational trauma. And she said to me as an aside, she said, it doesn't matter how many dot paintings you stick on the wall if you're actually not going to think about how you actually do the work. And she was brought in as a change agent, but then when she started to want to create change, she became sidelined in a way. She left in frustration. And interestingly, she wasn't just sidelined by the power structure within the organisation. She was sidelined by some members of her own team who for whatever reason, felt that she was presenting a concept of indigeneity that they didn't like. She was trying to straddle two worlds, I guess, and she'd worked in the business sector
And of
as
course,
well.
this is the thing: we don't have homogeneity in that in either side, because we often talk about business like there's a homogenous sort of array of businesses and groups, and they all work in the same way. And I think we do the same when we talk about identity and when we talk about groups. Any time we're talking about groups, we run the risk of that. There's diversity within groups, right? And so, and diversity within that indigeneity, like you say. And so there is a skill in boundary spanning. And I think that, I've created a career from it. I've always been on the intersection, and there is a skill in kind of crossing those boundaries or spanning those boundaries, because you can come up against resistance, and there is a skill in how you manage resistance. And I think that sometimes we almost throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we're coming up against competing worldviews without the skill to really kind of create a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what's happening there.
I mean, I think one of the contributors to my book is an awesome Indigenous scholar who, in many ways, is a brother of Tyson Yukup's work. It's around two-way thinking, and he sits in a major academic institution, but he sits in a place of grace where he understands that there's the dominant worldview, and there's a well-meaning attempt by the university to create these positions of Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous. And it is a two-way role. And it is very much about creating opportunities for voices to be heard and to bring country into the discussion and to engage elders at all levels in the university's practice and to bring Indigenous knowledge into all of the courses. It's an incredible job. I see that as it seems to be a very authentic effort to decolonize the university practice. Whereas what I saw in government, in the health and welfare department that I worked in, at some level it seemed authentic. There was a whole discourse around self-determination, and discussion papers were created, led by Indigenous scholars. But I didn't see enough evidence that it actually changed culture. Having said that, I can see some really good things going on in our state of Victoria. There is a truth and reconciliation process going on. But I think it must be very difficult for example, a First Nations person working for a team that is ostensibly dealing with the consequences of colonization, but the organisation and the system around them isn't prepared or able or willing or ready to deal with the causes, which is partly represented in the organisational culture itself. Javier, you must see that at some levels with maybe some of the clients that you have who maybe are working in organisational settings and trying to deal with that sort of systematic disempowerment.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely comes up in conversation sometimes. It makes me think about like the theme of DEI a lot, DEI in the U.S. and how there's the polarization politically in the U.S. that has made the movement of DEI hit some walls and challenges. The main thing that kind of comes up for me is that I don't think that there are some people that I don't think want to be inclusive. Some people do not want to be inclusive. And I think that's just the period, and because being inclusive does require work. Being inclusive does require acceptance. That means that things are not going to be the same, that things are going to change. Because as you bring new ideas and new people in and you create space that allows for the diversity, it's not going to be what we're used to, And some people are very afraid of that. Some people are very afraid of the status quo changing and shifting and no longer being centered as a result of that inclusion. And so it makes sense that there's resistance because people are afraid of that. But I do think that, if diversity is a sign of health in ecosystems, the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more healthy it's going to be. The more homogenous an ecosystem is, the more likely and the more easily it is to be wiped out. And so in thinking about organizations and society and culture, if we want to homogenize ourselves, then we can, but it runs the risk that we might get wiped out a little bit more easily. diversity is what makes us stronger.
I really
Have,
love that. And that's very telling in nature and in organizations, institutions, and in life.
Mm-hmm.
Javier, I'm just curious, have you had any opportunities to take your decolonization eutierria work into an organizational setting? It occurs to me, I'm not trying to give you advice on how to monetize your brand, but it seems to me that there is a place for that discussion to be had within organizational settings.
Yeah, as of now, no, I haven't. But the way that I conceptualize eutierria therapy, I want it to be addressing both the individual level, the group community oriented level, but also like the larger societal level. I sometimes feel that maybe I'm a little too ambitious in how I conceptualize this idea, but essentially, just to kind of give a little bit more understanding of what eutierria therapy is, the word eutierria is an emotion word that I have adopted from Glenn Albrecht, who is an environmental philosopher from Australia as well. And eutierria is the emotion of being at one with the earth and all of its life forces. So my idea, eutierria therapy, is a therapy that helps us to kind of re-experience that sense of oneness and harmony with the earth and life. I see my work as being an attempt to shift the culture. So I'd love to bring, eutierria therapy into organizations and to support on how to shift the culture to be more in connection with the land and with in relationship with each other. That'd be really cool.
Javier, can you explain, or maybe just give me a sense of what are the practices? So maybe there's some practice that you do already,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll see if there's applications in organizational life, because I can help you make that transition perhaps, and so can Iain. But what do you do? What is it that you do? What's a practice that maybe we could learn from and
Yeah.
shape for organizational life?
Yeah, so before I answer that question, I should preface that my main focus in my work is to address trauma. That is what my focus is, and both individual trauma, but also collective trauma. So one way that we do that is by teach my clients about different ways of knowing. I find that one of the most powerful ways to experience healing is through education, by learning and understanding what's happening inside of me. And so the Western way of knowing, is very objective, very based on scientific method, very linear. It's like, cause and effect. And then while that is valid and we do incorporate that, there are other ways of knowing. There are other ways of understanding. And so I aim to help my clients to understand how they can understand their experience better. One example of a way of knowing is through embodiment and listening to our bodies. Our bodies speak to us. Our body tells us stories. Sometimes in the context of trauma, we can't always verbalize what it is that we've gone through. It's more of a felt experience. And so by tapping into the body and listening to what the body is saying, it allows us to figure out, well, what is needed to heal. And so in my work with clients, I'm not necessarily the one that's bringing all of the therapeutic techniques. I also tap into their ancestry, their stories, their life experiences, and I let them co-create with me the healing practice that we then develop for the session in of itself. So kind of like decentering myself as an authority and allowing them to be their own authority for their own healing process. So that's one example of how I approach this.
And that is, because in some ways the therapist as the authority is a very Western way of doing
Mm-hmm.
therapy, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and so I love that co-creation, and that the ways of knowing I think could have a lot of application. I was just doing a webinar yesterday on teams and how to create teams once you have disruption in an organization. And part of what I was talking about was how we can intervene sometimes when we sense something isn't quite right, and we're not going to see that in performance results necessarily, or in the scorecard, in terms of say it's a project manager, you're not going to see that in the project management scorecard, but what you might get is a gut feel or some
Mm-hmm.
kind of bodily sort of sensation, or even just a discomfort, and it's very much it's very much a embodied sort of sense of knowing. And what I was encouraging people even on that webinar was to tap into that. That is actually a fantastic source of knowledge. And in fact, there was just some recent research that interviewed over 1,000 leaders globally on what made their large-scale transformation projects successful. And the differentiator was that those leaders that tapped into that sense of knowing and then did something, acted on it, created turning points for the whole transformation program that ended up being successful. The ones that didn't talked about stories of really not achieving the original transformation goals. So we can see that intuitive sense, or that those other ways of knowing that don't come from the spreadsheet in front of me, or the report in front of me, or the objective measures that I've created at the beginning, because I think I can create the future by measuring some dot through data. And I'm an evidence girl, so I actually really appreciate that evidence-based approach. It has its place, but it is one way of knowing. So I really appreciate that, Javier. I think that there's a lot of application there. Absolutely. And
I can't help myself. I have to ask, Josie, you're a sci-fi nerd, and I'm hoping
Yes.
Javier is too. It occurs to me that, bear with me, that Star Trek represented a decolonized approach to space travel. Because when you think about it, hang on a minute. Well, the power structure was, I guess, white, male initially, but it had a pretty diverse crew, right?
They did that. Even in the 60s, they created a diverse crew on television for the first time on television.
But also their mission wasn't to go and colonize planets and strip the resources.
The
it was
Prime
to
Directive, in fact, discouraged that, yes.
And
Javier,
what about
do you know what we're talking about? I feel like maybe Javier...
I do. I'm following. I'm right there with you.
So 7 of 9 was colonized by the Borg, but she was decolonized later.
That's right.
I rest my case.
And, interestingly, the bad guys were the race or the species that had as their primary mission colonization.
I need to Google this. I'm sure some geek out there has done a PhD on decolonization and the role of Star Trek.
And 7 of 9, I'm sure, even more specifically. Absolutely. For sure.
It's actually quite interesting because, you can actually see examples of popular culture trying to unpack what it means to be a colonizer versus someone who goes in peace with an objective to learn and create partnerships. But then I guess is the act of voyaging and discovery, does it inherently contaminate the cultures with which one interacts? There's a whole discourse around that too, isn't there, in some of those shows? Anyway, I think I'm going to put my mute button on again.
The worldview that I always have front of mind, because I have a personal mission, to increase the level of collaboration in our lives, in our world, because I believe that if we were truly collaborating, then that would solve a lot of the big problems in the world. Because collaboration, for me, true collaboration isn't colonization. It's about bringing the strengths of both parties or many parties together and creating something new. And I think that maybe voyaging into the unknown, like Star Trek, voyaging into the unknown and seeking through curiosity and exploration is that first step in terms of true collaboration, because that's a very different purpose than voyaging into the unknown with the mission to dominate and suppress the qualities of another, of the other. And I think that what we see a lot, we see this playing out in, politics. We see this playing out in organisational behaviour. We see this playing out in therapeutic practice too. We have some therapeutic practice that really seeks to minimise certain aspects over others, and I think that what we want to encourage is a way of amplifying the diversity, and nature does that. And you're right, Javier. Nature, by its very design, amplifies diversity for sustainability. So I think that we're there in terms of our thoughts, but not
aspiration.
In terms of our practice.
One final Star Trek question for Javier. Do you think Councillor Troy was practicing decolonising approaches when she... I always wanted to be her. She would walk around the ship having conversations which actually improved team culture, but also supported people on their own personal journeys.
I only recently started watching Star Trek, so I've only seen the more newer ones, like Star Trek Discovery and stuff, because my partner got me into it.
You have to go back to the old stuff.
Got to go
Javier.
back.
I gotta watch the old stuff, yeah.
Once you've met 7 and 9, there's no going back.
That's right. I think that there is a point where organisations and particularly I think leadership development is moving towards a more personal style of leadership, which is about connection, but it starts with acknowledging that vulnerability is part of leadership. So leaders acknowledge they're vulnerable and therefore can connect. And I think that there is, a lot of the leadership development programs that I've been involved in the last decade have had that component. I think where we need to move to, though, is a more collective approach to leadership, because almost what we're doing is we're creating, by aspiration, we're creating leaders that have that ability to connect, but then you need to change the environment to support connection and true collaboration. And I think that that's the next step. And particularly, I think that inclusiveness and understanding true diversity is important there.
Okay, so I've got a curveball for you there. From my perception of Indigenous culture is that it venerates wisdom of the elders, and yet so many of our organisations don't employ anyone over 50 these days. I don't even bother anymore. In fact, I was told anecdotally that people in the department where I worked wouldn't employ anyone over 50. So their rhetoric was about having fresh leadership, but it usually meant young people who had no content knowledge and no experience, and the organisations stagger and totter as a result.
Yeah.
My dream is for a world where institutions also venerate wisdom and actually allow older people to maintain positions of leadership, even as mentors. I mean, having a place for them within the organisation. Sadly, I just think my time is up in terms of being part of a formal institutional
and I think that's very sad, and that there's a lot being missed there. Javier, do you see, what's the utility, or let me use another word, what's the benefit and the wisdom that comes from the wisdom of elders in the work that you do, or perhaps in what people bring through their journey of looking at their ancestral wisdom?
I multiple thoughts running through my head. I have some clients that are older and that have been expressing a very similar sentiment of just like difficulties in finding work because they are aging out of the age range that is like the ideal for their particular profession. Just like the impact that has on them psychologically, their sense of identity, their sense of worth, their sense of like what they can contribute to the society and stuff. And I find it really sad because there is a wisdom there. Like, obviously, with lived experience, with professional experience, you're doing the work, but our society is designed in a way that doesn't really allow for older generations to have a place where they can feel like they can contribute. And we're missing out. Like, again, going back to this idea of diversity, right? Like, if you are not including those voices of people who have lived much longer and have the life experience and just the wisdom from lived experiences, you're missing out on things that could really help to support the organization and the things that you're trying to develop as society. This book that I'm reading, Decolonizing Therapy by Jennifer Mullen, she talks about the idea of supervision. So usually as therapists, it's recommended that we have a supervisor, someone that we can go to for advice. And she suggests the idea of intergenerational supervision, where you are providing supervision for each other. So you have someone who's older and someone who's younger, and you alternate. And so some days the older person is giving advice to the younger person, and other days the younger person is giving advice to the older person to improve the dynamic of therapy.
That's a great idea. And in fact, when I used to work at Telstra, we had reverse mentoring. But I like the idea of alternating, because I think what the program that I was involved in, it was reverse mentoring, where younger people are mentoring some of the older people in the organisation, mainly around digital engagement. But I love that idea that it can go both ways, because the role of mentor, of course, I mentor a lot of people and I learn from them all the time. So to think that the role of mentor is a fixed role is crazy. We've got to wrap up the conversation. We have talked in many different circles around many different topics. We've weaved together many different topics today around this concept of decolonisation. Can I just ask, perhaps I'll ask Javier first and then Iain, what would be your one or two or even three things that you think we could do as a daily practice, whether we do it as an individual practice or as a organisational practice, to be on the road to decolonize? I won't say to decolonize, our environments, because I think that's a long-term journey with small shifts along the way. But what are the things we could do to really be part of those small shifts towards decolonization?
Yeah.
Or you call it something else, Javier, don't you?
Yeah, so I think decolonization is the first step, and then I think the next step is re-indigenization.
Yeah.
Really kind of getting us back into the land. But I would say practice of healing. I think everybody needs to do their own healing work, their own ancestral healing work to be able to have capacity to do then the larger work of decolonization. But then the second thing is learning how to live in relationships, learning how to live in community. I think that in our Western societies, we learned how to be individuals, and even in organizational context and work context, it's about the success of the individual. But self-sufficiency is not enough. I think we need collective sufficiency and community sufficiency. And so learning how to be in community and live in relationships, I think, is the practice.
The question I hate most in the white settler colonial world is, what do you do? I would love it if we could change it to, I don't know, where are you from, or where do you belong, or where's your place, or,
yes,
tell me a place that you love, or something like that, something very basic.
And I had an experience of that actually when I was in Oman, because people in Oman were always asking people, where are you from? Where are you from? And in some ways, in the first 5 minutes, you'd understand where people were from, what are their religious beliefs, and even if the answer was, well, I don't have, I don't follow religion, it would then go on to other conversations about beliefs. So that was really interesting. I like that, Iain. That's lovely. Some really nice ideas. We could keep going. I'm going to have to wrap this up because we're running out of time. Thank you so much, Javier, for joining us. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation. I'm so happy we got here. Thank you, Iain, for being here as well. And I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions from people listening. I will put we've mentioned a lot of books today, so I will put the links in the show notes for people to grab those, and they can have a look and then perhaps have more questions from reading as well. So voyage out and explore. What's the Star Trek motto, Iain? I'm getting that wrong. Do you want to take us out with the Star Trek motto?
To boldly go where no one has gone before.
That's right, yes.
I'm trying to do that with my hand, but I can't.
Live long and prosper. Hang on.
I'll look at you.
All right.